What happens when your best friend suddenly becomes your worst enemy? In the world of global trade, that's exactly what's happening between the US, Canada, and the EU. With Trump's escalating trade wars and protectionist policies, the US is pushing its closest allies away. But here's the real question. Could this force Canada and the European Union into the arms of their biggest rival, China? And what would that mean for your everyday life? In a rapidly changing world, alliances are shifting, and trade wars are escalating. Donald Trump's protectionist America First policies have sparked tensions between the US, Canada, and the EU, historically some of its closest economic partners. But now, these key players are beginning to look elsewhere towards China. In this video, we'll explore how Trump's tariffs are pushing Canada and the EU to rethink their trade strategies. Could these once steadfast allies abandon the US for China's massive market and economic power? And what does this mean for global trade and your pocketbook? Chapter 1. Trump's tariff and the Canada-EU response. It all started with Trump's America First approach, a protectionist policy that led to tariffs being slapped on goods from both Canada and the European Union. For the US, this was an effort to reduce the trade deficit with key allies. For Canada, this was especially harsh, as Trump initiated tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, claiming they posed a national security threat to the US. On January 20th, as one of my many first executive orders, I will sign all necessary documents to charge Mexico and Canada a 25% tariff on all products coming into the United States and its ridiculous open borders, Trump declared, threatening more tariffs in an effort to address trade imbalances. The European Union, for its part, responded swiftly. The EU stated it would respond robustly and collectively to any tariffs imposed. Macron and other European leaders indicated that Trump's actions might strengthen EU unity, particularly in the face of Russia's growing influence and China's expansion. Canada, which shares one of the closest economic relationships with the US, was also drawn into the fray. The imposition of tariffs on Canadian exports like steel and aluminum in 2018 led to retaliatory tariffs on US goods like bourbon, peanut butter, and ketchup, hitting several American industries. Even today, these tensions remain a point of friction between the two countries. If these tariff wars continue, Canadians and Europeans will likely see higher prices for everyday goods. For example, as steel and aluminum become more expensive, the cost of manufacturing items ranging from cars to appliances will increase, potentially raising the prices of these products in stores. In Canada, industries like automotive and construction will feel the strain, leading to higher costs for construction projects, home renovations, and even cars. In Europe, similar effects will be felt in the manufacturing sector. Chapter 2. The impact of protectionism on Canada and the EU. Trump's trade wars are not just about dollars and cents. They're about geopolitics. The effect of his tariffs on Canada and the EU isn't just economic, it's strategic. As Trump's tariffs rise, both Canada and the EU may start to see China as a viable economic partner. Let's break down the numbers. In 2020, the EU's trade with the US amounted to $555 billion in goods, with Europe enjoying a trade surplus of about $150 billion. However, Europe's trade relationship with China is no small matter. China overtook the US as Europe's largest goods trading partner in 2020, with total EU-China trade reaching 586 billion euros, surpassing US trade by about 30 billion euros. Meanwhile, Canada, whose economy is closely tied to the US, saw its exports to the US total around $384 billion in 2020. However, Canada's total trade with China has been growing rapidly. In 2020, Canada's trade with China was about $25 billion in goods alone, a figure that continues to rise as both countries seek to expand economic ties. These numbers show a shift. As trade tensions with the US increase, both Canada and the EU are likely to recalibrate their strategies. Could China, with its massive market and economic potential, become a more attractive partner? A shift towards China means cheaper goods and potentially lower production costs. For Canadians, this could result in more affordable electronics and consumer products as China's manufacturing sector grows and becomes an even larger part of global supply chains. Europeans could see similar benefits, particularly in industries reliant on Chinese imports, such as technology, electronics, and textiles. However, with geopolitical tensions rising, there might also be trade-offs in terms of product quality or potential supply chain vulnerabilities. Chapter 3. The risk of pivoting towards China. Could Canada and the EU really pivot towards China? Let's take a closer look. Over the past few years, the EU and China have engaged in more complex and nuanced trade relations. In fact, China became the EU's largest goods trading partner in 2020. The EU has long recognized China as a key player in global supply chains, particularly in electronics, technology, and rare earth minerals. For Europe, maintaining good relations with China isn't just about trade. China is Europe's largest export market for cars, machinery, and pharmaceuticals. In 2023, the EU exported 114 billion euros worth of machinery to China and 4.6 billion euros in cars. But there are risks. The EU has become increasingly wary of China's state-driven capitalism, its growing influence in global markets, and its human rights record. Still, Europe can't ignore the economic opportunities China presents. For Canada, the relationship with China is trickier. While Canada is heavily reliant on its economic relationship with the US, it's also seeking to strengthen ties with China in areas like natural resources, technology, and infrastructure. For example, in 2020, Canada exported about $2.3 billion worth of minerals and metals to China, including copper, gold, and uranium resources that China heavily imports. But here's the catch. China's growing role in global trade isn't without controversy. Beijing's increasingly assertive foreign policies, such as its stance on Taiwan and the South China Sea, make it a divisive partner on the global stage. Still, Canada and the EU have to weigh the economic benefits against the geopolitical risks. For ordinary people, a closer trade relationship with China might mean more affordable consumer products, including electronics, textiles, and even household goods. If these trade relationships expand, the cost of everyday items like smartphones, clothing, and even cars could drop due to lower manufacturing costs in China. However, a deeper dependence on China may also expose consumers to risks, such as supply chain disruptions or lower product quality due to less stringent regulations in some Chinese industries. Chapter 4. The U.S. role in this equation. Trump's protectionist policies have certainly left their mark on North American and European politics. For both Canada and the EU, the U.S. has long been the most important economic partner. But as Trump's tariffs rise, it seems the traditional understanding of the U.S. as an unshakable ally is starting to fray. The U.S.'s trade deficit with the EU, in particular, has become a flashpoint. As of 2020, the U.S. trade deficit with the EU stood at around $184 billion in goods alone. Trump has repeatedly pointed to this figure as evidence that Europe has unfair trade advantages. The protectionist approach is hurting relationships with key allies, and it's opening the door for China to swoop in and offer an alternative. This shift is dangerous for traditional industries that depend on U.S. exports. For instance, the automotive sector in both Canada and the EU is highly vulnerable to tariffs as it relies heavily on U.S. demand for vehicles. For consumers, a strained relationship with the U.S. could result in higher prices for goods like cars, electronics, and pharmaceuticals, which are heavily traded across North American borders. But as trade with China increases, this could lead to lower prices for many imported goods. However, there's also the risk of market instability as countries rely more on China, especially given the geopolitical tensions surrounding Chinese policy. As the trade war between the U.S. and its closest allies Canada and the EU escalates, the question remains, is Trump's protectionist stance pushing these key global players closer to China? The numbers show a potential pivot, as both Canada and the EU look to mitigate the risks of a strained relationship with the U.S. by strengthening ties with China. For ordinary citizens, these shifts could mean cheaper products, new job opportunities, but also new challenges, higher costs in some sectors, disruptions in others, and a changing global landscape that will require careful navigation. Stay tuned as we continue to monitor how these shifting alliances will reshape the world economy in the coming years.
Hold on to your seats. A global trade shockwave is happening as Italy steps in to fill the void left by U.S. tariffs on Canada, a twist so unexpected, even the EU is in disbelief. In 2020, Italian exports stormed into Canada with a staggering $1.5 billion, and their wines alone smashed U.S. numbers with $409 million in sales. Welcome back. Today, we're diving into one of the most jaw-dropping shifts in international trade. Italy, long renowned for its culinary excellence, is now rewriting the rules in Canada's agri-food market. Thanks to slashing customs barriers, Italian wines and cheeses are flying off the shelves, leaving traditional powerhouses like the US trailing behind. Stay tuned as we explore how Italy's explosive market entry is shaking up global trade and what this means for consumers and producers alike. Chapter 1. Background on Trump's tariffs. Let's start by setting the stage. Back in 2018, President Donald Trump imposed a series of tariffs on several nations, citing unfair trade practices. Among the hardest hit countries were Canada and Mexico, as well as China. For Canada, the U.S. tariffs were particularly damaging because the two countries share one of the largest trading relationships in the world. In fact, the U.S. is Canada's largest trading partner, accounting for approximately 70% of Canada's total exports. Trump's tariffs on steel and aluminum, which were imposed at rates of 25% and 10% respectively, were seen as a protectionist measure to bolster American industries. But Canada, a major exporter of both commodities to the U.S., quickly felt the sting of these trade restrictions. Canada's steel exports to the U.S. were valued at $6.4 billion in 2018, and with tariffs in place, that figure dropped by over 38% in subsequent years. The threat of further tariffs loomed large, adding pressure on Canada to explore other trade avenues. How does this play out in the daily lives of Canadians? For consumers, the imposition of tariffs by the U.S. can lead to higher prices on goods, especially in industries like automotive manufacturing and construction. With steel and aluminum becoming more expensive, everyday products such as cars, appliances, and even homes could see price hikes. On the flip side, this has pushed Canada to seek alternative markets, which, in the long run, could help stabilize prices as the country diversifies its trade relationships. Chapter 2: Canada's Strategy to Diversify Trade. By mid-2019, Canada's government began to recognize that relying heavily on the U.S. market was no longer a viable long-term strategy. The possibility of further trade restrictions loomed large, especially with the looming implementation of U.S. tariffs on Canadian goods. To counter this, Canadian officials turned to Europe and China as potential partners to bolster their trade portfolio. In 2020, Canada's total trade with the European Union amounted to $115.9 billion, with Italy contributing a significant share to this total. What's particularly interesting is how Canada has increasingly engaged with Italy, a country with a strong and growing presence in the Canadian market. Italy has historically been known for its high-quality food products, such as wine, cheese, olive oil, and pasta. These industries have been key drivers of Italian exports to Canada, and the relationship between these two countries has been steadily strengthening, particularly since the ratification of the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, CETA, between Canada and the European Union in 2017. For everyday Canadians, a shift toward European markets, especially Italy, could have positive effects on the availability and quality of products. Expect to see more variety in high-quality Italian food products, such as wines, cheeses, and olive oils, becoming more readily available and affordable. The tariff reductions under CETA could also mean better pricing on many Italian imports, allowing Canadians to enjoy luxury items like artisanal foods, without the steep markup typically associated with imported goods. Chapter 3: Italy's Role in Canada's Trade Landscape. Italy's presence in the Canadian market is particularly notable in the agri-food sector. According to the most recent data, Italy is Canada's third-largest supplier of agri-food products, trailing only the United States and Mexico. In 2020 alone, Italian agri-food exports to Canada were valued at approximately $1.5 billion. This increase in trade is largely driven by CETA, which has reduced customs barriers and improved market access for Italian goods. The deal has been particularly beneficial for Italian food products, especially those in high demand among Canadian consumers, such as wines and cheeses. In fact, Italy has surpassed the U.S. as Canada's second-largest supplier of wine, with Italian wine exports to Canada reaching approximately $409 million in 2020. With the looming threat of U.S. tariffs, Canada saw an opportunity to further strengthen its relationship with Italy, positioning Italian products as a viable alternative to American imports in several key sectors. For Canadian consumers, this shift could mean an expansion of choices, particularly when it comes to high-quality foods. Think more variety in Italian wines, cheeses, olive oils, and pasta available on supermarket shelves, often at lower prices due to the elimination of tariffs. Many Canadians who already enjoy Italian cuisine will benefit from enhanced availability and more competitive pricing. Chapter 4. CETA and its impact on trade relations. The impact of the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement CETA cannot be understated. This landmark agreement has reduced tariffs, eliminated quotas, and opened up new sectors for trade between Canada and the EU. CETA has been instrumental in growing Italy's exports to Canada, especially in agri-foods, pharmaceuticals, and luxury goods. For example, the agreement has allowed Italian producers of wine and olive oil to access Canadian markets with lower tariffs, which has fueled an increase in exports. As a result, Italian agri-foods "We will not back down until the president takes the threat off the table," exclaimed Premier David Eby as he unveiled Canada's audacious strategy to block U.S. free access to Alaska. In that moment, the tension between two long-standing allies reached a fever pitch, setting the stage for a conflict that neither side could have fully anticipated. With President Trump's looming tariffs casting a long shadow over North American trade, Canada's bold maneuver promised to upend the status quo, challenging traditional power dynamics and igniting fierce debates across borders. At the heart of this unfolding drama lies the critical question: is this a calculated tactic or merely a bluff? In a twist of fate, the decision to restrict access to the vital Alaskan route was born not out of impulsivity, but as a deliberate effort to defend Canada's economic sovereignty and secure its own interests. The geopolitical landscape was shifting rapidly, and each declaration, every policy move, resonated with urgency and the weight of national pride. The free flow of commerce between the United States and Alaska has long been taken for granted, a seamless conduit that supports livelihoods and fuels industries. Yet now, as Canada steps into the fray with steely determination, viewers are left to wonder if the disruption will herald a new era of protectionism or forge a path toward deeper diplomatic engagement. This unexpected opening salvo challenges us to rethink the nature of international alliances and the human stories behind the headlines. Stay tuned as we delve deeper into the escalating drama, where economic strategy and heartfelt patriotism collide in a battle for the future of cross-border relations. The trade dispute between the United States and Canada did not materialize in a vacuum. Instead, it emerged from a complex interplay of economic policy and geopolitical strategy, where President Trump's decision to impose a 25% tariff on Canadian imports set off a chain reaction. This tariff was intended as a punitive measure, targeting industries and goods that, according to the U.S. administration, had been unfairly subsidized. However, the immediate economic repercussions were felt across North America, and nowhere was the impact more pronounced than in the strategic corridors linking Alaska to the contiguous United States. Alaska, isolated by geography, yet crucially important for its natural resources and trade routes, relies heavily on Canada's vast infrastructure. The Alaska Highway, also known as the Alcan Highway, cuts through British Columbia's rugged landscapes, making Canada an indispensable partner in maintaining a smooth flow of commerce. From airspace control to the rail and road networks, Canada's role has always been that of an unseen yet vital intermediary. As the tariffs loomed, Canadian leaders recognized that any disruption in this linkage would not only affect trade flows, but could also destabilize an economic system that has long depended on cross-border connectivity. Moreover, the very announcement of these tariffs acted as a catalyst for rethinking economic sovereignty. Canadian policymakers, having faced similar challenges in the past, were quick to mobilize. There was a palpable sense of urgency, the realization that the U.S. was prepared to leverage economic might without fully considering the broader implications for the interconnected North American economy. The surprise element lay in the fact that, while Trump's tariffs were positioned as a tool to correct perceived trade imbalances, they inadvertently forced Canada to reassert its economic independence as multifaceted as it was swift. The country's federal government, along with its various provincial administrations, quickly mobilized to counteract the potential damage from the tariffs. At the forefront of this response was British Columbia, BC, whose unique geographical position as the gateway to Alaska provided it with both the leverage and the responsibility to act decisively. BC's government proposed groundbreaking legislation that would impose tolls on commercial vehicles transiting through its territory en route to Alaska. This measure was not just about revenue generation, it was a symbolic and practical barrier designed to disrupt the smooth passage of U.S. goods, sending a powerful message that Canada would not be a passive conduit for policies it deemed harmful. The legislation also included provisions requiring that low-carbon fuel additives used in gasoline and diesel be produced domestically, a clear push to bolster local industries and reduce reliance on imported technologies and resources. This dual strategy of economic protectionism and domestic industrial support underscored BC's commitment to shielding its economy from external pressures. Simultaneously, other provinces adopted their own countermeasures. Nova Scotia, for instance, took a hardline stance by barring American businesses from bidding on provincial government contracts and doubling the toll fees on commercial vehicles using key transit routes. The province also removed U.S.-made alcoholic products from public stores, reflecting a broader strategy to prioritize Canadian goods over foreign imports. Alberta, known for its energy resources, echoed these sentiments by preparing its own set of retaliatory measures. Premier Danielle Smith warned that the tariffs were an unjustifiable economic assault, predicting that such actions would lead to higher prices and job losses on both sides of the border. She called for a national unification effort to dismantle internal trade barriers and fast-track resource projects such as pipelines and LNG facilities. Manitoba and Newfoundland and Labrador further extended the Canadian response by targeting consumer goods. Manitoba's government took immediate steps to eliminate U.S. alcohol from provincial liquor marts, while Newfoundland and Labrador initiated a comprehensive review of procurement practices, temporarily halting purchases of U.S. goods. These localized responses highlight a critical aspect of the overall strategy. Canada was not merely reacting to American tariffs, but was actively restructuring its economic framework to reduce its reliance on the U.S. market. The interplay between these actions reflects a broader dynamic of multilateral negotiation and strategic posturing. On one side, the U.S. administration was banking on economic pressure to compel a change in trade policies, while on the other, Canada was leveraging every available tool, legislative, fiscal, and diplomatic, to assert its autonomy. The responses from various Canadian provinces, though diverse in their specifics, were unified in purpose to safeguard their economies and to force the United States to reconsider the broader implications of its unilateral tariff strategy. As the initial rounds of countermeasures rolled out, the economic and political tension between the two nations escalated to a critical point. The situation became a vivid illustration of how economic policies can serve as both a weapon and a shield in international relations. While President Trump's tariffs had been positioned as a strategic necessity for American industries, they inadvertently provided Canada with a catalyst to launch a robust and well-coordinated defense. This escalation reached its zenith as the various retaliatory measures began to interact in unexpected ways. The tolls on commercial vehicles imposed by BC, the bans and fee hikes in Nova Scotia, and the targeted procurement suspensions in Newfoundland and Labrador created a patchwork of barriers that not only disrupted trade but also highlighted the contrasting economic philosophies between the two nations. In numerous high-level diplomatic meetings, Canadian leaders were observed debating the best way to channel these localized actions into a coherent national strategy. They stressed the importance of maintaining a united front, emphasizing that a fragmented response would only serve to weaken their bargaining position. The U.S. reaction, while initially dismissive, grew increasingly cautious as the repercussions of its tariffs began to surface. American industries, especially those dependent on the free flow of goods through Canada, started voicing concerns over potential disruptions in supply chains. The interdependence between the two countries, once taken for granted, now became a focal point in diplomatic discussions. Trade experts noted that the economic gridlock could have long-lasting effects on both sides of the border, particularly in sectors like energy, manufacturing, and agriculture. Moreover, international observers began drawing comparisons between this unfolding crisis and past trade disputes, such as the softwood lumber conflict and earlier tariff skirmishes from the 20th century. These historical parallels added a layer of gravity to the situation, suggesting that this was not an isolated incident but part of a recurring cycle of economic tension. The contrasting strategies of the two nations became even more evident when examining the underlying motivations. While the US was attempting to assert economic dominance, Canada was determined to reinforce its national identity and economic sovereignty. Throughout this intense period, the dialogue between the two countries took on multiple dimensions. Public statements, formal negotiations, and even behind-the-scenes communications all painted a picture of a delicate balance between confrontation and collaboration. Canadian officials, while stern and unwavering in their resolve, also hinted at the possibility of a negotiated settlement if the US would demonstrate a willingness to compromise. In contrast, the US stance, bolstered by a belief in the legitimacy of its national security claims, remained rigid at least for the time being. The economic stakes were high, with billions of dollars in trade at risk. Each decision carried the potential to reshape the regional economic landscape. This climax in the trade conflict was not merely about tariffs and tolls, it was a contest of wills, a battle for the right to determine the terms of economic engagement between two historically intertwined nations. The intensity of the interactions served to underscore a fundamental truth. In today's globalized world, the actions of one country inevitably reverberate far beyond its borders. In the midst of this heightened tension, Canada's multifaceted strategy emerged as a clear counter-narrative to the American approach. It was a testament to the resilience and adaptability of a nation determined to protect its interests while reaffirming its commitment to a fair and balanced international trading system. The unfolding events illustrated not only the economic implications of these policies, but also their profound impact on national identity, international alliances, and the future direction of cross-border trade relations. Ultimately, the escalating conflict revealed a complex web of interactions, a reminder that in the arena of global economics, every measure has a reaction. The bold moves by Canada not only challenged President Trump's tariff strategy, but also set the stage for a new chapter in North American trade relations, where strategic interdependence and economic sovereignty must find a new equilibrium. Hold on to your seats. A global trade shockwave is happening as Italy steps in to fill the void left by US tariffs on Canada, a twist so unexpected, even the EU is in disbelief. In 2020, Italian exports stormed into Canada with a staggering $1.5 billion, and their wines alone smashed US numbers with $409 million in sales. Welcome back. Today, we're diving into one of the most jaw-dropping shifts in international trade. Italy, long renowned for its culinary excellence, is now rewriting the rules in Canada's agri-food market. Thanks to slashing customs barriers, Italian wines and cheeses are flying off the shelves, leaving traditional powerhouses like the US trailing behind. Stay tuned as we explore how Italy's explosive market entry is shaking up global trade and what this means for consumers and producers alike. Chapter 1. Background on Trump's tariffs. Let's start by setting the stage. Back in 2018, President Donald Trump imposed a series of tariffs on several nations, citing unfair trade practices. Among the hardest-hit countries were Canada and Mexico, as well as China. For Canada, the U.S. tariffs were particularly damaging because the two countries share one of the largest trading relationships in the world. In fact, the U.S. is Canada's largest trading partner, accounting for approximately 70% of Canada's total exports. Trump's tariffs on steel and aluminum, which were imposed at rates of 25% and 10% respectively, were seen as a protectionist measure to bolster American industries. But Canada, a major exporter of both commodities to the U.S., quickly felt the sting of these trade restrictions. Canada's steel exports to the U.S. were valued at $6.4 billion in 2018, and with tariffs in place, that figure dropped by over 38% in subsequent years. The threat of further tariffs loomed large, adding pressure on Canada to explore other trade avenues. How does this play out in the daily lives of Canadians? For consumers, the imposition of tariffs by the U.S. can lead to higher prices on goods, especially in industries like automotive manufacturing and construction. With steel and aluminum becoming more expensive, everyday products such as cars, appliances, and even homes could see price hikes. On the flip side, this has pushed Canada to seek alternative markets, which, in the long run, could help stabilize prices as the country diversifies its trade relationships. Chapter 2: Canada's Strategy to Diversify Trade. By mid-2019, Canada's government began to recognize that relying heavily on the U.S. market was no longer a viable long-term strategy. The possibility of further trade restrictions loomed large, especially with the looming implementation of U.S. tariffs on Canadian goods. To counter this, Canadian officials turned to Europe and China as potential partners to bolster their trade portfolio. In 2020, Canada's total trade with the European Union amounted to $115. Trump's tariffs aren't protecting American jobs, they're a desperate power grab born from weakness. If you believe the U.S. can bully Canada into submission and force it to become the 50 honest state, prepare to have your mind blown by Canada's unapologetic, bold counterattack. For decades, the U.S. and Canada enjoyed a mutually beneficial, almost unbreakable trade bond. But now, amid Trump's shameless tariff threats, which he claims are designed to stop illegal immigration and drug trafficking, Canada has flipped the script. Prime Minister Trudeau, calling Trump's move a dumb trade war, has unleashed 25% retaliatory tariffs on $155 billion worth of U.S. goods. In this video, we dive deep into how Canada is not only standing its ground, but is ready to turn America's protectionist rants into a wake-up call for the entire world. Is Trump's economic bullying finally catching up with him? To understand why these changes matter, we first need to break down the economic relationship between the U.S. and Canada. These two nations share one of the world's most integrated trade relationships. Products that cross the border for assembly might make up to 8 crossings before they are fully manufactured. The automotive industry, for example, relies heavily on this back and forth exchange, with Canada supplying 89% of U.S. auto consumption. According to the latest figures, trade between the U.S. and Canada is $2.5 billion daily. The automotive sector is one of the largest contributors to this, but the trade also includes everything from minerals, essential for electric vehicle production, to agricultural products. The total economic cost of imposing tariffs on these goods is huge. It has been estimated that a 25% tariff on Canadian goods could reduce Canada's GDP by 2.5%, while the U.S. economy would shrink by 1.6%. That might sound abstract, but what does that really mean for people? Trump's tariff policy isn't new. During his first term, he imposed tariffs on steel and aluminum imports from Canada and Mexico, citing national security and job protection. However, his latest round of tariffs, imposed in his second term, has escalated the situation dramatically. On February 1, 2025, Trump signed executive orders that set a 25% tariff on most imports from Canada and Mexico, with a 10% tariff on Canadian energy products. His stated goal was to address what he called illegal immigration and the flow of fentanyl into the U.S., while also forcing trading partners to address trade deficits and bring manufacturing back on shore. The immediate consequences of these tariffs are starting to ripple through markets, with tariffs set to impact everything from automobiles to consumer electronics. Prices are expected to rise, and consumer behavior will adjust. Products like textile goods, automotive parts, wood products, and food items will likely become more expensive. This means that everything from the cost of your next car to the price of furniture could see an increase. Everyday items like toilet paper, canned goods, and clothing could see price hikes. Canadian agricultural products are key imports for the U.S., and rising tariffs could inflate prices at the checkout. For example, certain meats and vegetables could become pricier due to supply chain disruptions caused by the tariff wars. In a swift and unyielding move, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau labeled Trump's tariffs as unjustified and a dumb trade war aimed at destabilizing Canada's economy. Just hours after the U.S. tariffs took effect, Trudeau announced that Canada would retaliate with matching 25% tariffs on $155 billion worth of U.S. goods. The plan is to begin immediately on $30 billion of products, and then expand over the next 21 days if the U.S. tariffs are not withdrawn. This comprehensive retaliation package isn't limited to one sector. It spans consumer goods, food items, textiles, household appliances, and even targets specific politically sensitive products to put pressure on key U.S. states. Tariffs are also expected to heavily impact manufacturers. Goods like construction equipment, furniture, and home appliances are common imports from Canada. These industries rely on seamless cross-border flows of materials and machinery. For instance, a 25% tariff on Canadian machinery imports could result in a rise in production costs for U.S. manufacturers. Canadian businesses, especially those that rely on U.S. components, might struggle to absorb these additional costs, potentially resulting in layoffs or plant shutdowns. One of the most important commodities affected by this trade war is energy. The U.S. imports a significant amount of its energy from Canada, particularly oil and natural gas. Canada is the U.S.'s largest foreign supplier of crude oil, making up about 60% of U.S. crude imports. A 10% tariff on Canadian crude could increase gasoline prices by up to $0.20 to $0.40 per gallon. This could further inflate transportation costs, raising the price of goods and services across the economy. For consumers, it could mean paying more to fill up your car or higher energy bills at home. The economic impact of these tariffs varies region by region. States like Texas, Michigan, and North Dakota are especially vulnerable because they rely heavily on cross-border trade with Canada. For example, North Dakota sends 70% of its exports to Canada, making it the state most exposed to changes in this trade relationship. In contrast, states with less trade dependency, like California or Florida, will feel a less direct effect. While higher prices will hit consumers, the manufacturing sector will also feel the strain. Job losses in industries that rely on cheap imported materials are already being predicted. It's expected that 2.5% of Canadian GDP will be lost in the first year due to these tariffs, resulting in job cuts, reduced working hours, and factory slowdowns. In the U.S., companies that heavily rely on Canadian imports will face similar struggles, especially in sectors like automotive production and agriculture. The U.S.-Canada trade tensions also have significant currency implications. The Canadian dollar could weaken significantly as the trade balance shifts and demand for Canadian exports decreases. This could affect everything from tourism to international investments in Canadian businesses. Moreover, higher tariffs on machinery imports are likely to deter new investments, especially in manufacturing plants that require high-end equipment. The overall slowdown in trade could stunt both business expansion and job growth across both countries. While these tariffs might initially seem like an attempt to protect domestic industries, the broader consequences could be disastrous. Canada's energy, manufacturing, and agriculture sectors will bear the brunt of the economic slowdown. On the other hand, U.S. consumers will face higher prices, which could lead to reduced spending and weaker consumer confidence. Over time, both countries will need to restructure their trade networks and potentially seek alternative suppliers to reduce dependency on each other. But for now, the immediate fallout will hurt both economies and impact everyday lives in ways that will only become clearer as time progresses. As these tariff impacts unfold, consumers can expect higher costs for everything from basic household items to luxury goods. One potential strategy is to buy Canadian-made goods that are still relatively unaffected by the tariffs. Shifting to local suppliers could help reduce the impact of the rising costs of imported products. Additionally, monitoring price trends and adjusting household budgets to accommodate price increases on certain goods will be key. In summary, the U.S.-Canada trade war has far-reaching consequences that affect nearly every sector of the economy. Tariffs on Canadian goods and energy imports will push up prices for consumers and disrupt manufacturing on both sides of the border. The most vulnerable industries will face serious challenges, from automotive parts to energy. While these shifts might create some new economic opportunities, the immediate effects on your daily life will likely involve higher costs and changes in the availability of certain products. Remember, while these changes seem inevitable, it's crucial to stay informed and adapt your spending habits to avoid financial strain. Make sure to like and subscribe for more in-depth analyses of these ongoing economic changes. Let us know in the comments how you think these tariffs will affect you personally and what steps you're taking to prepare. In a world that thrives on global trade, what happens when a major economy decides to change the rules of the game? The answer is simple: nothing stays the same. You've probably noticed rising prices on products you use every day, from the latest tech gadgets to the cars you drive. But have you ever wondered why? The truth lies in the tariffs imposed by former President Donald Trump, tariffs that are still reshaping economies, businesses, and your wallet even in 2025. In this video, we're diving deep into the real, ongoing effects of Trump's trade policies, how they've impacted everything from your grocery bill to the stocks you invest in. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how these tariffs continue to affect your everyday life and what that means for the future of global trade. Stay with us as we break down the truth behind Trump's tariffs and why they matter more than ever today. Trump's trade policy primarily revolved around his America First agenda, which emphasized reducing the trade deficit and encouraging domestic manufacturing. His administration introduced tariffs on a wide range of goods imported into the United States, with the most notable targets being steel, aluminum, solar panels, and electronics. These tariffs were largely framed as a national security measure, invoking laws like Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962. The reasoning behind these tariffs was to reduce America's dependency on foreign goods and to push manufacturers to relocate jobs and production to the U.S. In 2025, the scope of these tariffs has expanded. New tariffs on products like semiconductors, copper, and pharmaceuticals have been introduced. For example, tariffs on semiconductor imports are set to rise to 25% alongside tariffs on pharmaceuticals. One of the most impactful tariffs to date is the Section 232 tariff on steel and aluminum, which continues to affect industries across the board, from construction to automobiles. These tariffs have been extended to include additional steel derivatives, impacting everything from car parts to appliances. In total, Trump's tariffs have targeted over $1.4 trillion worth of Chinese, Mexico, and Canada imports. And by the end of 2025, tariffs imposed on steel and aluminum are expected to raise $4 billion in revenue for the U.S. Treasury. So, how does this affect you? These tariffs make everyday products more expensive. If you've recently bought a new phone or any electronics, you've likely seen prices go up. That's because these products often rely on foreign components and materials that now cost more due to tariffs. Similarly, you might have noticed the prices of household appliances, like refrigerators or dishwashers, creeping up. Construction projects, whether it's building a new home or fixing a roof, are also getting more expensive because steel and aluminum, essential for construction, are now pricier. The immediate effect of Trump's tariffs on the U.S. economy was an increase in consumer prices. Import tariffs meant higher costs for goods that relied on foreign-produced raw materials. For example, industries like automotive manufacturing, which rely heavily on steel, saw production costs rise significantly. As a result, prices on consumer goods such as cars, appliances, and electronics also increased. Economists warn that tariffs could lead to inflation, which eats away at household budgets. According to a 2025 study by the National Bureau of Economic Research, U.S., consumers paid an additional $51 billion in tariffs between 2018 and 2023. Despite this, the tariffs did have some positive effects on U.S. manufacturers. By protecting domestic industries like steel and aluminum, the U.S. government aimed to boost local production. While some sectors saw growth, the net economic impact of these tariffs has been mixed. According to recent reports, tariffs on steel and aluminum have resulted in a modest increase in U.S. steel production, but have also caused a decline in other industries that depend on these materials. A broader concern is the potential impact on job markets. In 2025, it's estimated that the tariffs on key imports, such as those from China, Mexico, and Canada, could result in a loss of approximately 400,000 jobs across various sectors. Despite the growth in some manufacturing jobs, these losses are a result of retaliatory tariffs, which have harmed U.S. exports. Additionally, the U.S. economy's GDP has seen a 0.2% decrease annually due to the trade tensions and tariff escalation. For the average American, this translates into higher prices for common goods. For example, the price of cars could rise significantly. If you're planning to buy a new car, you may notice it costing more than you expected due to the increased price of steel and aluminum used in manufacturing vehicles. If you work in an industry reliant on imports, such as agriculture or technology, you could feel the effects through job insecurity or reduced wages. Moreover, for those with 401k investments or involved in stock trading, this uncertainty can create volatility in stock prices.